Good afternoon. Before we begin, let's have a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this time we have to study your word, and we're thankful for your church. We ask that you would help us as we study to understand it, and that we would write it on our hearts, and that everything that we learn we would apply in our lives, and that we would try to be like Christ in everything we do. We pray these things in his name, and amen. Hey, and welcome. We're going to continue our study today that I'm calling What in the World, about some of the perplexing angles about Jesus' parables. And we last time I thought had an interesting study about this introduction that Jesus makes to why he teaches with parables. And he does that right after he introduces the parable that we call it of the sower. I've heard it probably more aptly named the parable of the soils. And we're going to look at that today and look at his interpretation of it. But I wanted to review a couple things while we're starting here, just so we can be on a level set. First of all, what we said last time is that the purpose of our study is to understand why Jesus taught in parables and understand what the application is. That's why I'm calling this What in the World, because these have spiritual application, but the application is right here. The application is going to be in this body right now, and obviously preparing for an eternal spiritual purpose, but that he has a reason for doing these things to change lives. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. The other thing we said was that we're going to be looking for a single purpose in these parables. Even though we're going to look at the parable of the soils today and try to understand the different types of soils, it's really one message he's teaching. It's not a multiple messages. And I think if we expand that too much, we're going to lose the power of what he's doing. And of course, we want to know how it changes our life, how these things that he's teaching have meaning to us. There's some things that we're not going to do that maybe you've done in other classes that are about the parables. We're not going to be extremely organizational about grouping them up into different sections. That's not a bad thing. I don't think it's wrong to do that, but it's not the way we're going to approach it. We're going to look at each one by itself and try to understand what it's saying. I've also heard people talk about how there are didactic and evangelical and prophetic, and they're trying to categorize them. Once again, it is an effort that is good, and I think it can be helpful to people, but I don't think Jesus sat down and he said, everyone sit down, I have a didactic message for you. He was speaking to simple people. And that's another thing we want to make sure we're looking at, that these are for the everyman. He had been teaching in the synagogues and had been teaching the academic people, the people who were religiously elite, and he was reprimanding them. He was rebuking them. But then he went off to the seaside and taught on the hillside, and that was designed for every man. That was designed for the people who he was really evangelizing to, which is the simple people. One of the things that I didn't mention last time that I thought, that I've heard and I thought might be interesting to bring up just for your thought, is that there are people who say that these parables are true events. That I've heard people say that these are things Jesus saw happen, or that he knew some of these people. And in particular, I've heard the Samaritan, that the Good Samaritan was maybe someone Jesus knew. That is possible. Obviously, we don't know that. Other people say that these are apocryphal, or that these are stories that we don't know if they're true or not, or they are made up on purpose. And I think a better way of saying that is that these stories were created by Jesus in order to give a message, or that there's a mix, or that some of them are stories he created, other ones are true stories. But the important thing here is that it really doesn't matter. We can't know the answer to that, and it does not matter to the message he's sending. I personally believe that these were carefully crafted stories. These stories were written by him, and seeing the environment and using things that everyone in Palestine would have seen and understood. And I think that he wrote them for that very purpose. And so I think it's just an interesting factor. You'll have to come to your own conclusion on that. But today what we want to do is look a little bit further into the answering of this question that he was asked. He told the parable of the soils, and some call it the parable of the sower. And then after he told that, he was immediately asked, as we said last time, why do you speak to people in parables? And the important answer he gave was, because to you has been given the understanding it has been revealed to you, but to them it has not. And there was some purpose in the fact that there was a mystery that was being revealed, and that there was truth that was being revealed here, and it was being revealed in a very particular way, so that sincere-hearted people could receive that revelation, could receive that message, and those who did not care or were not willing to make the effort would not get it. And so that's going to come out even more clearly when we look at this, this particular message when he interprets it. So I'm going to read real quickly to you what he told in the original telling of it, and then we're going to go through his description. And once again, this is a very fortunate situation where Jesus explains the interpretation of the parable. And I think that is because the interpretation of this parable is the answer to the question, why do you speak in parables? It was very enlightened of him to say, I'm going to tell you a parable, and when you need to know why I'm teaching in parables, the parable of the soils is why. And that's just, I think, an approach to it. So what he said was, in verse 3 of chapter 13, it says, Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seeds, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. And so it's just an interesting story he's telling. Obviously, it got the attention of the people, and the disciples did come and say, why are you teaching them in parables? Maybe looking for a more straightforward approach. Jesus knew that wasn't the proper approach. But I know a little bit about planting seeds, and I will tell you, I know a very little bit. I like to garden. In fact, I think maybe it would be good right now to take a little field trip with you and show you what I'm doing, and you'll see that I'm not great at it, but that it's something that I care about. And so let's just take a minute and do that. All right, let's go back out in the back. All right, so this is my seeds. You can see some of them have come up pretty good. Some of them are slow. Some of them aren't coming up at all. But I think it's just timing. Here's where I put some stuff over here that has to be in the shade. This is my tomatoes and cilantro. And I put it here because if it's in the sun, it completely gets scorched out and doesn't grow at all, gets droopy. So this has been working pretty good. Let's go check out in the front. So you might be asking yourself, why do I have a garden in the front yard? And it's mostly because I can't get anything to grow on any other part of my house. Some of my neighbors were pleased about this, some were not pleased. But you can see I've got some things. I used to have a lot of broccoli and tomatoes, peppers, just a few peppers left. But now I've got some zucchini and squash. And they get really droopy if the sun hits them too hard. Some of this soil is good, some is bad. And I can tell you where those spots are. But let me tell you what, here's my bearing fruit right here. I'm one of the greatest parsley growers in the nation, I think, and lemongrass. But anyway, mostly just a reason to show off my garden. But I figured I would get some credibility for understanding sowing and seeds. Okay, we'll head back. Sorry, you have to look at my hand. But all right, so let's continue and let's look at the actual interpretation. And I don't know that that's the right word for it. I'm just going to use that Jesus explains the parable to them. And they had asked why he taught that way. And so when he described the reasoning behind it, we looked at that last time, and it takes some thought to understand the reasoning why he's teaching them, that it is intended for good, sincere-hearted people to accept it and to use it, and for opponents not to be able to attack it, and for people who don't care, it bounces off of them. And so what he does when he explains this is, I think he gives us a more depth of knowledge in that specific thing. And so let's look and let's just compare the two sections. And so we know back in verse 3, he said, "Behold, the sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up." So this is the basic concept. And I think sometimes people take this and they focus on the sower as the point of this parable. And it is quite clear as we continue that the sower is not the point. This is not about lessons for the sower. It is about the soil. And so we don't want to laser focus in on that. I've even heard sometimes that this was just written to preachers about the proper way of sowing. And I'm not saying that it's not useful to preachers. I'm not saying that it's not helpful. But we cannot be distracted by the fact that this is about the method. It is more about the preparation of the soil. And so, first of all, he says, the sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and birds came and ate them up. Once again, this is something that people in this Palestinian area would understand. They've seen farmers casting seed, and they know how that's supposed to work, and they know that when it falls on the side of the road, it's not going anywhere, and the birds are going to come and get it. And so what we're going to look as we go through this is for some specific things. We see that there is a sower, but then we see that there is seed that is sown. We see that it lands somewhere that is referred to as soil. And then there are some obstacles in these first few examples, and we're going to focus in on those things and see what we're supposed to learn from that. Then let's jump to verse 19. And so verse 19, he says, "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road." So this already helps us get a glimpse of understanding of what he's talking about, and it already points out the genius of his teaching method. First of all, let's talk about the fact that he has now defined what is the seed. He says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom, and he clearly defines that the seed that is being sown is distribution of the word of the kingdom. We might even say the gospel message, but I do want to point out that he says it very specifically when it is the word of the kingdom. And I want to make note here that we have to understand what the kingdom is in order to understand what the word of that is. Once again, whenever he first talked about, when he was first asked about why he teaches in parables, he talks about the mysteries of the kingdom, the revelation of what is going on with the kingdom. And so I want to just give a few pieces of input for you to think about. First of all, we know that the definition of a kingdom is, it is the domain of the king. A very simple definition. It is where the king has domain. And so it is an organization that the king rules over. It also is, in this case, a king who has a plan for his people. It is a ruling king. In the case of our king, it is a loving king. It is a Lord who has grace and mercy. And we've learned that there's a direct connection of the revelation of this mystery of the kingdom, of the gospel of the kingdom, and Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. That we have God's grace and mercy and have salvation through him. And what this all comes together to be is a spiritual kingdom. It is a nation that God has created that is now expanded outside of his physical nation of Israel. And now to the Gentiles and to everyone, he is building a kingdom, a spiritual nation of people that are under his rule and are part of his plan. And I think that's a really important way for us to see this, that's the gospel that's being preached here. It is a gospel of the organization of God's plan and his salvation through Christ. Now, I've heard people say and I'm not going to disagree with it, that people say the kingdom and the church are the same thing. I've heard arguments made that they are most certainly not the same thing. And I've heard people say that the kingdom and the church are the same thing. And I understand that there is a relationship. There is an inextricable bond between the kingdom and the church. But I'd like to propose to you that though they are sewn together, no pun intended, though they are melded together, they are not the same thing because they are not the same kind of word. They are not addressing the same thing. A kingdom is an organization. It is the domain of our king, and it is the spiritual nation. The church is people. The church is the people that are part of that domain. And I think it would be like if we say we are Americans and we live in America. America is the domain and we are Americans. And so in this case, the nation is America. That is, the kingdom is America, even though we don't have a king in America, though some would argue that. And the people are Americans. And so in this case, the kingdom is made up of the church. And so I'm not trying to split hairs on that, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but I do think it's important for us to understand that this gospel of the kingdom is talking about that God has a plan and he is going to save his people and create this spiritual nation. This is the gospel that's being sown. This is the seed that's being sown. And he says here that the ones that fell beside the road, or some of them say wayside, the ones that fell beside the road are people who do not understand. That is, they've gotten this word, they don't understand it, and the evil one comes and snatches it out of their heart. So that is that they don't get it, and the devil comes and steals it. In this case, it says the birds came and pecked it up. I'm going to tell you, in this case, the birds are the devil. If I was going to rewrite it, I would say it's squirrels. I think squirrels are the devil, and they're the ones most likely to steal food. But we'll put that aside for right now. I hope you understand that squirrels are worse than birds. But in this case, birds pecking up that seed is just like the devil coming, taking it out of the heart because it's a rocky place. The seed goes somewhere where the person doesn't understand it and it doesn't dig in. And that's what he's talking about when he says that seed fell by the side of the road. Now, this is something that the Bible talks about, that the devil is trying to keep people from understanding the word. The devil wants people not to let that word get implanted. And so let's look at an example of that in 2 Corinthians 4. So turn to 2 Corinthians 4 in verse 3. It talks here about how the devil is an opponent to people understanding the word. It says in verse 3, "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." This is a picture of what the devil wants, is he wants people to not understand and to not believe, and he wants them not to see the light. And so this first section here just tells a story about how the seed does not get into the heart, the person doesn't understand it, that soil of the heart. So we have the seed of the word of the kingdom, the heart of soil, and when that word gets to that person's heart, it's hard and it's not going to go in. So that's the first example that we see. Let's look at the second one. This starts in verse 5, and he tells the story about others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And like I said, I have a real problem with this because Tampa's really hot, and you have to keep it in good soil or they're going to shrivel up. They're going to just get scorched and shrivel up. Now Jesus then explains this in verse 20. So jump to verse 20 where it says, "The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away." And this falls away is, in other versions, is stumbles, or other translations is stumbles. But he gives us once again a very clear definition to the people who were new farming in Palestine. They got this immediately. That the first one is by the side of the road. and it's too hard and it doesn't get in. The next one is rocky places. And in those rocky places, it says it's received, but it can't get firm root. The roots can't go down. And there's something to be said here about it being temporary. And I want us to notice that it tells us what it is that causes the stumbling. It says, because of the word, they are afflicted and persecuted. So this affliction and persecution is what the evil one is in this example. The evil one is affliction and persecution, but it's coming as a result of the word. That is, that they have accepted the word, and something's coming upon them that is discouraging them. There is an attack coming upon them because of the word that's causing that. And I think there's a lot to learn about this, where a person receives it with joy, and then it doesn't root. And I think we understand that. I think Americans are really good at starting things and not finishing them, or starting off really strong and not finishing something. Even when you talk about gardening, if something doesn't get firm root, but it shoots up, sometimes that's called bolting, but something maybe shoots up and gets a really long stem, and it doesn't get firm roots, it's just going to wither and die. And so that's true even scientifically. But it's true with us. I mean, we learn that when we deal with dieting and exercise. I can't tell you how many diets that I've started where I'm like, man, I'm going to lose weight. And then I start off starving myself for 3 days, and then I'm finished and I got to have a Butterfinger. And so I think that's the idea, that if you don't let it work right and take your time and use moderation, then it can shoot up too fast, or you can do something that causes you to get discouraged, and you don't let those roots set, and you don't get the encouragement. I can't tell you. Whenever I decide I'm gonna go bike riding, and I want to buy the best bike, and I'm gonna invest in a really good bike, and the first time I go out and try to go up that hill on Glenarvan, and I'm totally worn out, and I think, I'm just not a bicyclist, I'm going to sell the bike. This is the idea of a person who doesn't have the commitment. They have decided they really want to do it, they get excited, but they don't have the commitment. And because of the lack of root, when persecution comes, when hard times come, they just don't have the ability to endure it. So that's the idea there of the concept of the rocky places. We've seen by the side of the road, we've seen rocky places where it can't get firm root. And now let's look in verse 7. Verse 7 says, others fell among thorns, so that the thorns came up and choked them out. And then he explains that in verse 22. In verse 22 it says, and the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And I think this is another one that we can understand, where he says this is an example now where it does have ground. It can get into the ground, it can find soil, and the roots can go in, but the stuff on top is grabbing it and pulling at it and stealing from it. And it's so interesting what he says, where it is the worry of the world. And this is, once again, the evil one is the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth. And this, to me, is one of the ones that I think we might be able to understand the best. That now there is an opponent outside of our hearts. There's an opponent vying for our heart. In this case, he says it's the worry of the world, or I've seen it said the worry of this age, or this time period, just the way the world is right now. I mean, we know better than any time perhaps in our lives what worry is about in this world, about living in an age where worry is going to weigh us down. And they can't handle, that is, our heart can't handle that competition. Our heart, this worry is vying for our heart, and the evil one can win. The deceitfulness of wealth, we understand that as well. Let's look at 1 Timothy 6. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 9. We know this verse, and you probably could quote it, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Can you see the very clear connection between 1 Timothy 6 and what Jesus is teaching here? That the deceitfulness of wealth chokes out the word. So this word of the kingdom, it's a great word. This word of the kingdom is it's good news, and it's a great spiritual organization that God has created, and He has a great plan for us. But we get weighed down with worry. We get weighed down with what money can do and pursuing money. And it says, just like in 1 Timothy 6, that the temptation is a snare and many harmful and desires, foolish and harmful desires, and it says it plunges men into ruin. It totally steals that. And so the concept here is that the thorns is competition. It is vying for the priority, and it causes, even though roots might have grown, it steals that. Let's look at Romans 12. If you've ever studied with me before, you knew Romans 12 was coming, but I'm sorry it applies here. But Romans 12, verse 1 and 2 talks about this idea of the world trying to steal. In verse 1, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Once again, we are to be transformed from the world, be changed. The concept of conforming means to have the same shape. So instead of having the same shape as the world and changing ourselves to match that, we transform. We have changed form, and it allows us to defend against that competition of the world, against that word of the kingdom that is trying to take place in our heart. So that's the idea of the thorns, that the thorns are growing up and they're stealing all the nutrients, and they're tearing away, just like a garden that's just full of weeds. They're stealing all of they're competing for all of those nutrients and the light, and they just kill the plants. Now let's look in verse 8 at this final one about the good soil. So in verse 8, it says, and others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And then Jesus says in verse 23, he explains again, and the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who bears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. So in this case, we have this picture now of good soil, a good heart that is ready for the word. And obviously the idea is that they understand it, because it says here, the difference is on the side of the road, the wayside, it says that's a person who does not understand the word, and so it does not take root. But here in the good soil, it is the person who understands it. It is the hearer who understands it, and the heart takes it in, and then the outcome is bearing fruit. And I think that's a really important part of this, that the outcome of a seed planted in good soil is obviously fruit. It is not just that it took root, it is that fruit is produced. So the roots are important. The roots have to go down, but then what shoots up is bearing fruit. So I want to look at a couple verses related to that, because the question has to come, if the good soil brings about understanding, that is a heart that, and once again, this is these people who have a sincere and honest heart, and that heart accepts the word and they understand it, then the outcome is bearing fruit. And so the question has to be, so what does that mean? What does it mean that fruit comes out of that? And so Galatians 5 is the obvious answer to what is the fruit. Galatians 5 and verse 22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. This idea that if we hear the word of the kingdom and we hear about God's plan, we hear about his spiritual kingdom, what we're going to do is bear fruit that is loving other people and having peace and patience and kindness, doing good things, thinking good things, having faith, being gentle, having self-control. This is what fruit is. And we should be very careful about what constitutes fruit. And there are lots of things that we do and that we believe that are true and good, but they are not necessarily categorized as fruit based on the biblical definition. There are people who say, well, yeah, my fruit is that I never miss church, and I don't cuss, and I don't drink, and when we assemble with my church, it's done in the proper way, and I pray frequently. these are all essential parts of the Christian life, very important things. But that is not what the Bible defines as fruit of the Spirit. Now, they may be part of that, and we might use the fruit of the Spirit and all those things, but bearing fruit refers to the outcome of our understanding being doing good and creating peace and this relationship that we have with other people being part of God's plan. And so I don't want in any way diminish that there are things that we believe and that we do that are essential parts of a Christian life, of a faithful life. But when this talks about bearing fruit, what Jesus is saying here is when you understand the word of the kingdom, you are going to love and do good, and it's going to be obvious. In fact, if you look at Matthew 7, it's another very good example of what the outcome is. So let's look at Matthew 7 real quick. It says, and this is an idea of how do you differentiate between false prophets and true prophets? How do you differentiate when people are confusing in their message? And he says in verse 15 of Matthew 7, "Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles are they. So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits." And this is so important to me that he says here, the outcome of understanding the word of the kingdom is that you are producing fruit that's recognizable. That when you do things and you act in a certain way and you deal with people in such a way that it's recognizable that you understand the word of the kingdom. So I hope you'll think about that, about does your life exemplify an understanding of the word of the kingdom? The gospel message, when you're converted to the gospel message, does it begin a life that has a recognizable set of actions, a set of fruits that say that person is good. That person is one of God's people because they bear fruit that are from God's kingdom. And so I hope you'll think about that. Now, the last thing he says here is that the fruit that they're bearing brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And we looked at that parable, the talents as it's called, about people bringing forth different levels of outcome from their talents. This is clearly a scriptural concept that everyone brings fruit in different proportions. That we don't all bring the same fruit and we don't all bring the same amount of fruit. We bring our talents and we bring our understanding of this word, and we bear fruit in different proportions, and that is okay. Not everyone is going to give the same proportion all the time. Not everyone gives the same amount. Everyone is struggling and working to do good, and some are giving 100-fold, some 60, and some 30, and all of them represent a heart of good soil. And that's okay. It is designed that way. The response to the word of the kingdom is designed that way for everyone to bring their talents and to produce fruit in their own way. So just as a review, the idea here that some seed fell beside the road, and that is where people just didn't have any room, made no effort, and it really just bounced off, and the devil took it away. Then the idea of rocky places, that this heart that is like rocky places is somebody who has this initial excitement or this initial joy, but they have no commitment. They have not made the proper commitment to that, and what happens is when hard things come along, it tears it away from them. Then there's the idea of the thorns, where maybe there is root, but it's not a priority, and your heart can't handle the competition of worry of the world or of money or of riches or things outside. It steals it away, and because your heart can't handle the competition, you lose it. But then the good soil bears fruit. That's the definition. A person who understands the word of the kingdom, the good soil bears fruit, just like it does when we're trying to grow plants anywhere. So I hope this has been helpful to you. To me, it's so interesting to see that Jesus was teaching here how the word is delivered, how people accept it, and with this parable of the soils, he explains why teach in parables, because in order for that word to be understood properly and the revelation of it to get into the heart and to be implanted and grow fruit, it really has to be a sincere person who makes an effort and is willing to make that commitment. So I hope that was helpful to you today. I appreciate you listening, and we'll continue on studying more about what in the world and the perplexing parables of Jesus next time.